Okay, so I think we should start. So it's a pleasure to have Chris Bauch here today. He will give us a good overview to the situation, COVID-19 situation in Canada. Before we start, I would like to make a little advertisement for our email list. So I would like to hand over for a second to Lisa, and she will tell us about how you can keep in touch with us for a second.
So yeah, we have set up a new mailing list, so it would be great if you could just fill out the form. I will also post the link in Zoom so that you can keep up to date on our roundtable discussions as well as seminar talks, which usually happen on Thursday evenings European time. So this would be 5 o'clock UK time or 6 o'clock European Central Time. Yeah, and that's actually all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. So opportunity to keep in touch. And yeah, I think we should right away start then with Chris. So go ahead, Chris.
Okay, thank you. So it's good to be here virtually. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so can everyone still see the slides? So can everyone still see the slides?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Great.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So like Marcus said, I'm going to give an overview of the pandemic in Ontario and a few models that we have developed. We have at least 3 models, but I might only have time for the first 2. So after giving the overview, I'm going to address one question, which is, should the province of Ontario reopen and reclose all at once or county by county? So local versus global approaches. So we used a model to address that question. And the second question is, should we prioritize the vaccine when it becomes available for older individuals or for those who actually cause the most spread? And if I have time, I might touch on the class size question. If there are any questions, during the talk, I'd be glad to answer them either during or after. So this is Canada, and I really just wanted to emphasize perhaps the lesser known fact that it's geographically very large, but most of the population is concentrated in this narrow strip of land close to the border with the United States, which has implications for epidemiology and politics and culture, of course. Ontario is this section here, kind of this odd-shaped section, and most of the population of Ontario is down in the southeast. By the way, can you see my my mouse when I move
Chris,
it?
Chris?
Yes.
Yeah, Chris, sorry to break you, interrupt you. I think we don't see a change of slides at the moment. I don't know for what kind of reasons.
Oh, okay. So
Still
are you still on the title
slide?
Huh. Okay, how about now?
Nope.
Okay, maybe I'll just do it outside of the, okay. I think that's fine. I'll just do it outside.
Yeah. Now it's working.
Okay, I'll just
do
this in
that
this
is
mode.
fine. Now it's working, Chris. Yeah, now it's working.
Okay, and can you see my mouse when I move it?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I was just mentioning that most of the population is in this narrow strip of land close to the border, and Waterloo, Toronto, Guelph, they're all down here in this little section that kind of dips down into the Great Lakes area. I like to call this a dagger aimed at the heart of America. But now that Trump is gone, maybe that doesn't matter so much. And this is just the zoomed in area. Again, and even within the scale of Ontario, you can see that we have these high density areas around Toronto, the so-called Golden Horseshoe, contrasted with this very sparsely populated area here, with small towns. So not only is Ontario geographically very diverse, but also in terms of its politics and its culture. So we have a small anti-mask movement here, not as big as the States, but they are present. Now, next I'll move on to the actual timeline of the pandemic and the epidemic curve. So here in the top, we have COVID cases by date of reporting in Ontario, and in the bottom, we have deaths. And here we have in mid-January, the first case coming to Toronto, and then a long period of quiescence. And I like to compare this to starting a fire with flint and steel. So you're making sparks by striking the flint against the steel, and you keep doing it, and eventually an ember lands in exactly the right spot, and you have the beginning of the epidemic in Ontario. So early on, the state of emergency was declared in March 17th. They closed schools and all non-essential workplaces. We saw a rise in cases. As you can see, it took about a month to flatten the curve. And then the deaths also peaked in this period. And then following this was a very gradual decline over late spring and summer. And over this period, the main changes were that, testing capacity reached a kind of higher level than it was at first. Mask use became more common, both through mandate and through choice, such that now it's very normal to see most people using masks in a variety of contexts, with some exceptions. And also, the province started a phased reopening during this time period. Phases 1, 2, and 3. And so by August 3rd, we were in phase 3, which still has restrictions, but you can go to restaurants, you can go to gyms, etc. And then school began early September in Ontario, and as schools reopened, people spent more time indoors. Cases started to rise, of course, and now we're at a very critical juncture where a new control plan has been introduced. I'll say more about that in a moment. Deaths are much lower, and this is, I believe, for a number of factors. First of all, we're getting better at managing very severe cases. Second of all, we're capturing more cases through reporting than we were in March. And there are also some hypotheses that have not been tested widely, but seem plausible. For example, you may have heard of the inoculation hypothesis, the idea that if you get a higher initial dose of the virus, you might have a more severe infection. And wearing a mask would reduce your inoculation and therefore protect you. And this hypothesis explains, for example, the fact that Japan had very low death rates in March, despite the fact that it was the first wave, and despite the fact that they have a very elderly population. And one reason might be that everyone just masked up right away. So this is the trajectory of testing. In blue, we have the testing. As you can see, it's been ramping up. And the purple is percent positivity, which is thought to be less dependent upon testing volume. And as you can see, positivity has been going up, currently at around 4.5% in Ontario. So I mentioned these new guidelines. These are color-coded. So we've gone from this phase 1, phase 3 to a color-coded approach. Green is the lowest level where you prevent, and that's if daily cases are below 10 per 100,000 and positivity is below 1%. And then as you go from yellow, orange, and red, you implement more control measures. for for higher thresholds. So for example, red is more than 100 daily cases per capita per 100,000, and test positivity above 10%. And at this point, these broader public health measures are implemented. Now, here's the trick. That's very vaguely defined, and what the government has decided is by broader public health measures, they mean conditions, restrictions that are not that strong. So for example, restaurants can stay open for indoor dining if they have 10 or fewer individuals inside. Gyms can stay open with restrictions, and this is at a 10% positivity rate. And the only mention of a more severe measure like lockdown is at an unspecified threshold. So essentially, what's happened under this new system is that as of a couple of weeks ago, we have one region near Toronto called Peel, which is in the red zone. And here's a map of the Toronto area. There's the downtown area. Peel is a suburb. So is York, Durham, and Halton. These are all suburbs around Toronto. So Peel is currently in the red area. Orange is Toronto, York, our capital, Ottawa, and basically everyone else is in yellow or green. Now, when they implemented this red control measure in Peel, they actually had less strict restrictions than under the phased approach. So in other words, as cases are going up in Ontario, they are lifting restrictions under this new approach. So essentially what's happened is the province, as far as I can tell, has abdicated responsibility for the pandemic and is downloading it to cities and counties. Now, just zooming out once again, you see these regions here close to Toronto, which are highly populated, and then a lot of the population here. Ironically, this is called Southwest Ontario, even though it's in the southeast, because everything is with respect to Toronto. And I want to show you another graph which really underlies the effect of this huge heterogeneity in geography. So here we have cases, April, May, June, July, and this shows the per 100,000 cases by health unit. And you can see that these large concentrated areas, Toronto and suburbs, account for a huge proportion of the cases, and they have very high rates per capita. And then mid-sized counties like Waterloo, where my university is in the middle, and you have very few cases in these outlying counties with very low population densities. So this is a really staggering difference in terms of the caseload, which some countries may not experience this to quite the same extent, where if they're more connected and are highly urbanized. And then we see the same heterogeneity played out at the level of the whole country. Here I have cumulative cases per 100,000 in Canada up until present. Ontario has 578. So that's in the middle of the pack. And then we have 5 up here in the Arctic area. And here we have the Atlantic bubble. So this is Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia. And they formed a travel bubble. They said, well, we don't have many cases, let's keep it that way. And they formed a bubble where you can travel within these provinces, but if you want to go to the bubble, you have to go through a longer process. And they've kept cases very, very low, 42 per 100,000, 100 per 100,000. And this, of course, contrasts strongly with the US, which is essentially very problematic. So this shows, again, cases per 100,000. The lightest color here is 0 to 1,000 cases per 100,000. Here we have 4,000 to 7,000 cases per 100,000. So an order of magnitude larger than many Canadian provinces. And then, of course, some European countries, you'll be more familiar with these numbers. So Canada basically falls across this span. France is comparable to Quebec with 1,000 cases per 100,000. The UK is more like Ontario or Hungary. Malta is surprisingly high given that it's an island, and Iceland is lower because they have rapid testing and they're isolated out there in the Atlantic. So that's just an overview of the pandemic in Ontario. Now I want to go into how do we model this, and our framework for our approaches is different from many existing approaches. So in particular, we say there's a need for a coupled human environment approach. So what conventional epidemic models do is they treat human behavior as fixed over time. So you might have some very sophisticated representation of age or geography, but the transmission rate is just a constant. And if you want to change things like mask use or physical distancing, you just kind of move some parameter up or down exogenously at some point in time t. But of course, human behavior is rarely fixed. And in fact, we could not have flattened the curve without widespread population adherence and acceptance. And so this really emphasizes, especially during a pandemic, when we have to rely upon non-pharmaceutical interventions, that we have this two-way interplay. So on the one hand, populations respond to incidents. When cases start to go up, people get worried, governments get worried, they impose restrictions. So there's a reaction. And of course, in the other way, as soon as people start to react with non-pharmaceutical interventions like distancing and masks, that influences disease dynamics. So from a modeling perspective, we have a coupled nonlinear system where you have some dynamical system for social dynamics like opinion spread, behavior, social norms, learning. And then we have our nonlinear disease spread, and we couple them together in our approach, and we analyze the coupled system to see what it does. So to give one example of what we've done, the first question was formulated back in March. And the question was, should the province of Ontario reopen and reclose all at once or county by county? And this was a debate that was going on within the province. The premier, Premier Ford at the time said, we should do it all together. If we're going to reopen, we reopen together. If we close together. And the reason he cited was travel. He said, well, if you have one place that's open and one place that's closed, people will just travel from the closed area to the open area. And this will just cause a resurgence in cases. But this was basically based on an assumption. There was no model to support it. And so we decided to look at this question with a model to see if that scenario would actually play out. Would people actually travel to the extent that it would undo the gains of a local approach? So this was work done with our postdoc, Vadim, and collaborator Madhur from University of Guelph, who's in the School of Environmental Sciences. So you've probably seen this many times by now. We went with a stochastic compartmental model where people are susceptible, then they enter this stage where they're carrying the virus, but they're not yet infectious, the so-called exposed compartment. And then they become pre-symptomatically infectious. So this is a short stage where a lot of transition occurs. And then they can either become asymptomatically infectious or they become symptomatically infectious. And this distinction has a relevance for testing and contact tracing and isolation. And then after that, they recover. So as a stochastic model, we basically used standard probability theory to determine the probability that a person is infected. So for example, if you have n people in your local area who are infected, and your chance of getting infected by one of them is t, then to calculate your probability of being infected, it's simply 1 minus the probability of not being infected by any of them. So not being infected by the first person and not being infected by the second person, times not being infected by the third person, that's 1 minus t to the power of n, the number of infected people. 1 minus that gives you the probability of being infected by at least one. And well, the actual equation was a bit messier than that because it was compartmentalized by disease status and testing status. The main thing you should focus on here is this expression here, whereby we assume that the transmission in each county depends partly on the population density, because there's more transmission in denser populations. And this is what these two terms accomplish. By tweaking the value of C and C here, we can determine exactly how the transmission varies with population density. And then, as I mentioned, we include testing and isolation. We structured the population geographically by census metropolitan area. And then we use commuting data to model travel between census areas. And here's an example of that data. So these are the census areas on the axes by where you live and where you work. And we had this strong diagonal entry suggesting that most people stay within their town to work. The pink here is the Greater Toronto area. So these bands represent people in Toronto and the outlying suburbs. So these are all the commuters who have to put up with the rush hour traffic commuting to the Toronto city center from the outlying areas. And then we have these sparse areas here on the other off diagonals. Now, so we have travel. We also have school and workplace closure based on triggers. So when incidence exceeds a certain threshold, we close the schools and workplaces. And we also had this behavior, as I mentioned. So we assume that individuals adhere to distancing in response to local case prevalence. In other words, the more cases they see in their county, the more they distance. And in particular, we just assumed a very simple form, an inverse exponential, where P plus is prevalence of positive COVID cases, and P is total population. Omega is proportionality constant. So we assume that people reduce their contact as an inverse exponential of the percentage of infections in their county. Okay, so that's our very simple behavioral component in this case. So we calibrated this to reported cases by census population area. And here we have them laid out by density, smaller counties out here, and then Ottawa, York, Peel, Toronto. And then we have the proportion of cases in blue. And then these dark blue lines are the model fit. So as you can see, in general, we have more cases per 100,000 in these higher areas, and the model can capture that because of our transmission function. Okay, so here's basically the baseline dynamics. On the left, we have log of active infections. On the right, we have opening and closing. On the top, we have the local strategy going county by county. And down here, we have the global strategy province-wide. And so what the colors here show is that we have higher cases in the bracket area here, which is Toronto and Ottawa. And we have few, sometimes no cases in these outlying areas that are sparsely populated. And then here we have the kind of local strategy. So in both cases, we start off with this initial province-wide closure in March, where all counties are ordered closed. And then there's reopening. And then we allow the counties to open or close independently based on the trigger thresholds. And I believe this is not too similar from what Germany has done with its federal system with these triggers. As you can see here, for much of the pandemic, or about half of the pandemic after March, Toronto and the suburbs remain closed. They close, they open, they close, they open. And then some of the outlying cities and towns like Waterloo and Kitchener also have to close and open. And other places can remain open. And whereas this is the pattern for the global strategy. So let's look a little bit closer at the strategy as it depends upon your trigger. So here we have the global strategy, and here we have local. Here we have that trigger threshold in terms of cases per 100,000 on a logarithmic scale in both strategies. Red is the proportion infected. Black is the proportion of person days closed. So number of persons affected times number of days of closure throughout the pandemic in the black here. And then in magenta, we have county days. So that's the number of counties closed times the number of days. And what we've picked out here is a kind of optimal strategy in both cases, whereby at this threshold in the dashed blue line, you get only a small increase in cases compared to strong lockdown, a 2% increase compared to strong lockdown. And we calculated what that optimal prevalence is for that 2% increase for both strategies. Now you can see for the local strategy, you have a 43% proportion of person days closed at the optimal level, whereas for the global strategy, it's 55%. So that means there's a 12% increase in the person days of closure under the global strategy compared to the local strategy. And also, there are much more counties that are closed under the global strategy as well. So the other thing to notice here is that the trigger prevalence is more permissive for the local strategy at this optimal level. So for example, at the global strategy, you're triggering at around 4% for 4 cases per 100,000. But for the local strategy, it's more like, well, it's a log scale. I can't tell for sure, but it looks like 20 per 100,000. So the local strategy allows you to shut down a little bit later than the global strategy. And that's another reason why you don't have to spend as much time under lockdown under this local strategy. And we also looked at a sensitivity analysis where we doubled the travel rates and we found similar findings. So even if we double the baseline rate of travel, local lockdown works better. Okay, but there's an important caveat. You have to coordinate. So this approach is not an excuse to act like cowboys. So each of the counties have to use similar thresholds and similar testing rates. And if they don't, the benefits are degraded. So for example, here we have infections and person days of closure. And as we increase the variation between the trigger prevalence, for example, we see that cases go up and person days of closure go up under all of our assumptions here. So this lack of coordination can reverse those benefits. So that's an important caveat. We did some sensitivity analyses as well. I won't go into detail here because it's in the interest of time. But one important thing is that in the univariate analysis here, we show that testing of asymptomatic persons and the testing rate of symptomatic persons have a big effect on the results. And in fact, if your testing probability can be very high, you can have a very relaxed closure threshold. This scale here is inverse log. So in fact, if you have a very high testing rate, you don't have to close down until you hit maybe 30 cases per 1,000, which is very lax. And so this just emphasizes that it's the public health mantra that public health is saying again and again: test fast, trace fast. That's the best way to contain the virus. I think this message, it hasn't gotten through to many governments, but this is the key. So in summary, what we've seen from this first model is that local lockdown can reduce cases as much as global lockdown, while also significantly reducing the impacts on schools and businesses. So there are big social economic benefits. This is another thing about messaging that I think is important, is that I think when the public hears us talk about lockdown and public health, they assume we don't care about business closures, which is, of course, is not the case. We care about this as much as anybody else, but sometimes we have to keep saying it so they know that we care, and we have to put it in our models too as an outcome and understand the effect of lockdown on these things. But there are important caveats. Testing and lockdown criteria have to be coordinated across health units, and we have to act fast. So the counties have to lock down promptly as soon as the triggers are reached. And like I said, our analysis also emphasizes, the importance of testing and contact tracing. The only reason I didn't talk more about this is that we know it's important, and it's not a novel result. So it doesn't get you, it's not as interesting to focus on from a modeling perspective. Okay, so I think I'll just talk about one more model today, which is our vaccine model, which is an important upcoming decision we have to make. And in particular, should we prioritize the vaccine for older individuals or those who spread the infection? And this work is still in review. It's with our PhD student, Peter. So the background is that supplies may be initially quite limited. So we may have to decide who gets the vaccine first. On the one hand, the elderly suffer high death rates from COVID. But if you ask anyone what their gut instinct says, it's to immunize vulnerable groups first, such as the elderly. However, immunizing those who cause the most spread could be a more effective way to reduce COVID deaths. And this question is a great example of a good application for models because we had this trade-off. And so the question becomes, for which population or which conditions does the trade-off tip in one way or the other? So to give an intuition for why this can be such a powerful trade-off, and I should mention that this is not a new question. It's been explored in the context of influenza vaccination quite frequently over the past 10 or 20 years. And the intuition is basically as follows. So here we have a situation where we have many cases. So cases are in red and susceptibles are blue. So when cases are very common, my choice to get vaccinated only offers weak protection to others. And that's because if I vaccinate, I may not pass it to my friend here, but they could get infected by somebody else when there's a lot of cases around. So the indirect benefits of vaccination are weak. I only protect myself, basically. But when cases are rare, and if I get vaccinated, I offer strong protection to my friend because the chances they get infected by someone else are now low. And not only do I protect this person, I protect the person that they would have infected. So you have almost a chain of protection that percolates to the population if I choose to vaccinate. So the indirect effects are very strong when cases are rare. Now, when does that happen? Well, cases are rare when infection is not very transmissible. So we have a low basic R0, basic reproduction number, or when we have many recovered individuals. So in the case of COVID-19, we have a relatively low R0 of 2.3, and herd immunity will only build this winter, and we'll have many recovered individuals by January, February, March. And so this, to me, suggests a very strong case for taking the strategy seriously when the vaccine becomes available. If it becomes available soon enough, there will be enough people who need the protection, but there will also be quite a few recovered persons. And this could work very effectively, the strategy. So we decided to investigate this question. So we used an age-structured compartmental model, same as before with this pre-symptomatic stage, with 5-year age intervals. We added seasonality. This is kind of controversial with respect to humidity and temperature effects, but we know there's a very strong seasonal effect in terms of contact patterns. Because as soon as it gets cold, people head indoors and they socialize indoors. So we included seasonality. Contacts can occur in the model in schools, workplaces, home, or elsewhere. We have school and workplace closure in response to infection incidents. And then we have individuals respond to incidents of infection in their decision-making processes. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then the vaccine moves individuals into the R compartment. So if you get vaccinated and it's efficacious, you go straight to the R compartment there. So this is what the model looks like. It's basically a standard SIR model. We have the seasonality here. We have 3 stages of susceptibility here because our baseline model explores a scenario of revaccination. And then we have infections, we have recovereds. Here we have contacts. Contacts are broken down into work, school, office, and home. And those, other and home. And those depend upon X. Now, X is a dynamically changing quantity. As X goes up, more people avoid shopping and community outbreaks, and they may even take precautions at home if their family members are symptomatic. And X is described by this differential equation. Now, it has a form kappa x1 minus x. I don't have time to derive it, but this comes from a social learning process where people sample others and adopt successful strategies. So this is an evolutionary game theory argument where people copy successful behavior. So we have the imitation here, and this is the utility function. When there are more infections, I here, when there are more infections, X increases, but there's also a cost to distancing, and therefore X goes down according to this term here, because distancing is hard, and there's a cost associated with it. And I'll talk briefly about this. This term basically ensures that you don't get stuck at the boundaries, and it heterogeneity. It represents the anti-maskers who will always be an anti-masker, no matter what's happening in terms of the infection. Okay, so very briefly, we used a Bayesian particle filtering to infer parameter values based on Ontario case reports and Ontario Google mobility data. And I'll show you that in a minute because it's very interesting. And then we fixed the parameter values based on demographic data, mortality, the polymod contact matrix data. This is a funny story because this is an extremely well-used data set now. And this was spearheaded by Joel Mossong at Warwick back when I was a PhD student. And I was involved in the pilot study along with 5 other biology students and postdocs. And each of us recruited 5 of our friends to do this study. So we had this diary, we recorded our contacts, we did saliva swabs to see if we would get sick. And that was kind of the pilot project that Polymod was built on. And then we used epi literature for the other parameters, latent period, infection period, etc. And we looked at, for vaccine scenarios, we looked at 4. So we looked at oldest first, so give it to 60 plus first. We looked at youngest first, give it to 20 or younger first, and then everyone else gets it after that. We looked at uniform, which is basically give it out to everybody equally. And then we had this interesting strategy that Peter thought of, a leading eigenvector strategy, which is basically you give the vaccine in proportion to the leading eigenvector of the next generation matrix. And as it turns out, this tends to give vaccine first to 20-year-olds and then less to 20 to 60-year-olds and working adults, and then et cetera. And then we looked at 2 scenarios for vaccine availability, January or July next year, and then vaccination rates ranging from 0.5% to 4.5% of the population per week. So basically a bunch of different scenarios for when the vaccine could become available and how many people we could vaccinate per week. Here's what I want to show you, and this is really interesting, I think. What we have here is the cases over time, and here we have mobility measures over time, measuring distancing. In terms of cases, we have the data in the dots, and this is our best model fit. And it has this typical behavior, this kind of increase and then a gradual decline that replicates the data well. And then in terms of distancing, what we have in orange is the decreased amount of time spent at retail and recreational outlets from Google mobility data. So this was our proxy for how well people were adhering to distancing restrictions because those closed non-essential businesses. And so that would be reflected in a reduction in recreational activities, time spent at bowling alleys, et cetera, and also time spent at shops. So that's the orange dots. And then the work data here is our green dots, and you have this representing weekdays, and of course, weekends, not as many people work. And then we have our X equation here fitted to the data. The X equation was fitted to the orange data, and as you can see, it can fit it quite well. And the reason I think this panel is so important is that when you talk about modeling behavior, the first reaction is that it's too complicated to do it. And yet in this case, if you look at the population level behavior, it's basically like an epidemic curve. And this is exactly like the output of many low dimensional ODEs. In this case, we've used an ODE, which is mechanistically motivated using known mechanisms that describe human behavior, copying strategies from other people. That's what we do all the time. And it can fit the data very well. And in contrast to the disease model, which has dozens of parameters, we have, I believe, only 10 or so here compared to the dozens here. And some of those are actually, they're not real independent parameters. We just multiply age distributions by constant. So we have much fewer parameters here than in the disease model. So you can model behavior, and you should do it if you can. So the other thing we observe here is that the model can capture this ebb and flow we observe in the first wave, and that we are continuing to see in the second wave. So for example, this is cases, and this is distancing. And so this first peak here is what the model we fitted. And as you can see, cases go up and then down again, distancing goes up and down. And the model predicts this kind of widespread fall epidemic activity, and distancing goes up as well. And then there's a lull. And then what happens here in this dashed line is that vaccination begins on July 1st. And we're vaccinating at, I believe, 1% of the population per week, if I'm not mistaken. And so we're vaccinating, so the vaccine helps, but it's at this low rate, it's not enough to prevent a third wave in March 2022. But what's interesting here is that the size and timing of the wave depends a lot on your strategy. So if we vaccinate oldest first, we get a large and early peak. But if we vaccinate youngest first, or uniform, or we use the leading eigenvector, the peak is delayed and it's much smaller. So this shows an example of a situation where it makes sense to interrupt transmission rather than target elderly for vaccination first. So I guess we posted this back in September, but the model was predicting this peak, this fall peak back in July and August when we were working on it. And this is not really a big deal, because anyone who's studied this for long enough, and anyone who's working with models would be predicting a fall peak ahead of time. So this is just one parameter set. But this holds true across a range of parameter values. And I'll skip this one because this kind of shows the parameter plane, which gives a broader sampling of parameter values. So on the top here, we have a vaccine available in January. At the bottom, vaccine available in July. On the horizontal axis, we have percent of the population vaccinated per week. And here we have how aggressive the government is in terms of shutting down. So when T is 250%, the government waits until cases are 2.5 times the spring wave before they shut down. When it's 50%, they shut down when it's only half of the spring peak. So we're actually somewhere around here. It looks like the government's waiting for a long time. We can see here present which strategy works best. So blue is oldest first, orange is youngest first, etc. And we can see here, I think I'm breaking up a little bit, but we can see here that if the vaccine is available in January, you should usually vaccinate oldest first, unless the vaccine rate is very low. But by July, things have changed. In that case, you've built up more recovered persons, and you should actually vaccinate one of the other strategies, so youngest first or contact-based. So the later in the pandemic, the more the stronger the case is to vaccinate to the groups that cause transmission. So I want to leave a bit of time for questions. I do have some other plots which kind of just emphasize this point more. For example, when R0 is higher, I'll just focus on this one. So for example, as you increase R0, the percent decrease in mortality is pretty consistent for oldest first, but you lose gains. You lose gains for the other strategies. So in other words, as you increase R0, again, oldest first retains its strong lead, but the others do worse. So that just again emphasizes that when R0 is lower, you should vaccinate younger age groups. So in summary, what we learned from the second model is that later in the vaccine, the transmission interrupting effects of vaccines could be very powerful. And this is something we need to consider seriously for vaccine allocation problems. Hence, the vaccine should be distributed first to working adults and school-aged children late in the pandemic. So the question then becomes, well, how do you know for a given population what to do? Now, I think this is a strategy that could easily be implemented. And you don't even have to do a sophisticated social ecological or social epidemiological model such as ours to address this question. what you have to do if you want to explore this possibility as a public health authority is first do a population seroprevalence survey a month before you expect to have the vaccine. This will ascertain your baseline level of recovery in the population. And then you can simply use a conventional epidemic model like an age-structured SIR model without behavior, and use as the initial condition the percent recovered that you observed in your seroprevalence survey. And that will tell you relatively straightforwardly with old-fashioned tools whether or not you should vaccinate the elderly first or children. And so, if you have enough lead time to do the survey, then you could actually figure this out for real populations easily. So we had a third model on class size, but I won't talk about that in the interest of time. So I'll just wrap up with some kind of overall comments. So the first comment is we really can't model these multiple pandemic waves without using these coupled behavior disease models, because the multiple waves are an outcome of coupled behavior disease dynamics. The second point is that, jurisdictions with good testing capacity can reduce the economic impacts of lockdown with a local instead of a global approach. The third finding is that we may want to use the vaccines to interrupt transmission by giving it to spreaders instead of vulnerable groups later in the pandemic. And I didn't talk about this model, but large class sizes are a bad idea during a pandemic, which won't surprise many people. So yeah, I'll be glad to take some questions, but first I'd like to thank all of my tireless students and colleagues who have basically dropped much of their work in the past 6 months to focus on this problem. My colleague Madhur, my colleague Dylan, and our many PhD students. These are the three I talked about, but we have other students working on things like critical community size, digital contact tracing, and second wave modeling. And of course, thank you to the funders for supporting the work without whom it would not be possible. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Chris. That was an excellent talk. Yeah, we have still a little bit of discussion. So I would like to open the discussion so you can just ask a question by switching on your microphone or use this hand tool. Then I can see it here on the list. The hand tool is, where is the hand tool? Yeah, there. Okay. I think you know it from previous lectures. So maybe I start the question, because usually it always takes a little bit of time before somebody starts. It's about a question about the last point you made. So that is very interesting that COVID-19 pandemic can only be understood by having a coupling between social dynamics and epidemiological dynamics. So that makes it very interesting. And that's why, for example, I personally thought one should incorporate much more, for example, behavioral scientists and political scientists into this, because there is a way you can isolate these problems from each other. But I think your local lockdown versus a global lockdown approach is very interesting. So I would like to start with that topic. The usual argument against that is that you have this kind of transportation problem. So if there's a lot of traveling, then you go to to places where you spread the infection. Then and you seem not to be too worried about that, which is good, because as you said yourself, from an economic point of view, that is of course the much better solution. But really try to understand two things. One is, what is really the government should use for these cases? Is the mobility data from, let's say, from before the lockdown really reliable, because people just might go to, to restaurants somewhere else and having a good time there if they want to. So there is a question about the modeling here. And secondly, how is that related to what kind of places are actually in lockdown in these different, I don't know, you had these different color-coded policy measures?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And in our model, we assume that if a place is closed, if a county is closed, then people don't commute there for work anymore. But if a place, we didn't model, we didn't model displacement effect. So for example, if you open restaurants in Waterloo, we didn't try to model the demand process there because our behavior model was very simple. We kind of did it in a very simple way. We said, well, let's assume the travel goes up 200%, 300%. So that models displacement effect in a very simple phenomenological way. But a more sophisticated approach would be to say, well, how many people are there in Toronto? Say some percent who normally go to a restaurant this week. What fraction of them would go to Waterloo? I guess the short answer to your question is, you're right that I think there are real concerns with travel. And the exact question depends, the answer to the question about whether local or global is best really depends on the details of the population. If we were to rerun this model in a highly connected population such as Germany or the UK, where there's much more public transport, the answer might have been very different. But as it was, we modeled it for Ontario, where, to give you one example, there's a town, Sudbury, of 200,000 people, but it's 4.5 hours from Toronto, and they've had almost no COVID cases, or very few. And even though we reopened locally and this approach was implemented, there was not a big surge of people going from Toronto to Sudbury. Maybe it increased somewhat, but for everyday purposes like dining out, getting your hair done, most people don't want to drive that far to go to dinner. They'll just do takeout instead. But you're absolutely right. This is not a blanket recommendation. And like I said, even for Ontario, we found that it only works if there's coordination and if your testing capacity is up to scratch. If those conditions aren't there, then it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Are there? There is one question by David.
Hello. So yeah, I have a question. So the argument is as follows. So transmission is driven by context, and context by behavior and movement of people, right? So do you think we could sort of get around of the complexities of introducing also behavior in our models if we could fit simpler epidemiological models with daily data, detailed movement data that then determines the rates of contact, and of course are driven by behaviors, but are introduced through a matrix of contacts between people and so on. So do you think we could get around the complexities of introducing behavior, or do you think it's a complementary approach, or what do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they're complementary. And I think the approach you're describing would be useful for near-term forecasting. So if we want to predict cases over the next 2 weeks, that would be exactly the way to do it. You would use your mobility data and try to extrapolate based on recent trends. The two applications where that wouldn't work so well is longer-term forecasting and scenario planning, and also trying to understand the impact of interventions. Because if you want to know the impact of introducing an intervention in the future that doesn't exist yet in the population, then the recent trends, you can't predict it because you can extrapolate, but there's no mechanistic reason to think the extrapolations will be accurate. So So those are the two cases where you really need a mechanistic approach to behavior. But yes, indeed, for forecasting, extrapolating trends can work well, especially if nothing else is changing in terms of what the government is applying as in terms of control measures.
Can I ask you about something about behavior, because that just fits into the answer of your questions very quickly. I think if I understood it correctly, this is from, you took a kind of game theoretic approach here. But as far as I can see, it didn't take into account any memory effect. But don't you think that, for example, in these second lockdowns, you have actually a memory effect because, or you remember, how tired you are, you don't want to have again this lockdown. And so behavior might be different according to what the history was before. Do you think that makes a big effect, or?
I think it's a very important effect. And it's something that we're contending with now because we're revising the model after peer review, and we have to use the recent data, which are showing exactly this effect. So we're experimenting with a fatigue function, which accumulates in the population the longer that a lockdown is applied, and it makes people less likely to distance, etc. And we've also seen this effect in a simpler model I couldn't talk about, but we have a simpler model that's been published in Frontiers in Physics, where again we have this kind of fatigue effect, and the interaction of the fatigue and the government lockdown gives rise to a second wave, basically all the time in any realistic parameter regime. So I think that that's what we're seeing now is fatigue and seasonality, which is causing this big increase in cases.
Yeah. Any other question?
Yeah.
Yeah, Luca?
I have a question, yeah. Regarding the health system, I mean, how did you include the effect? I mean, what is the situation at the moment in Canada regarding the health system? Does it have a stress? I mean, a really big stress? Is under stress, or is it able to cope with the situation?
Yes, at the moment, yes. One big surprise from the March wave was that our ICUs were never at capacity. And so far, that's also the case. I think Toronto is the worst case at 80% ICU capacity at the moment. That's not to say we won't have problems in December, but so far our ICUs are operating within their usual bounds.
Okay. So you don't think that, I mean, do you think that could be important to include in the model the capacity of the health system?
Yes, I think it's important for projecting outcomes like hospitalizations and deaths, because if your capacity is exceeded, your death rate will obviously go up. In these models, we try to get something together as quickly as possible that we can be confident in terms of the quality of the model. So we focused on cases, mostly in the first model, and in Peter's model we use deaths as well. So we did not include ICU capacity in that case, and we simply didn't have time to put it in. But it's an important caveat that we're assuming that the ICUs will not be overwhelmed, but that could not be the case as of December. We're not sure yet.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. I think Marcus froze up.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. Huh.
Maybe we should move to the second model and talk about vaccination a little bit, also to cover that, because that was also a very interesting part of your talk. can I ask you an initial question about that? And that is about the speed of vaccination. So I guess in your model, you had somehow an infinite speed. So the rollout was instantaneous. Do you think, because we know, for example, the Pfizer vaccine would be hard to distribute. You have all this deep freezing necessary in every hospital. So you might not be able to do that at small places and things like that. So do you think that would have a drastic effect?
Yeah, that's an important factor. And, I don't understand much about, that's called the cold chain and the supply into the vaccine. So instead, when we said, vaccination starts July 1st, we're assuming that by July 1st, they've been able to get the distribution system up and running. And, July 1st is the date that shots go into arms. But of course, these delays could be important. And in the revisions, we're going to look at a March availability date, because January, it looks like it might be too early because of all these factors that you're mentioning. But March, possibly could happen by the time they get the distribution set up. We might be able to start, giving people the jab in March. So we didn't model that explicitly, but it's important. And we tried to kind of pick these start dates according, adjusting for what experts tell us the delays will actually be like.
Oh, okay, yeah. Any other question about that?
I have a question. So
yeah, okay.
Loss of immunity is taking into account in estimate. I didn't read the paper, sorry, I should have. But so the model you presented about vaccination is taking into account also loss of immunity or not?
Great question. No, it isn't. And in the time between we posted that paper and now, some studies have come out showing that immunity wanes. So we need to do, for our changes, our revisions, we need to do a scenario where people can lose immunity. And of course, that could have an important impact on the predictions.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, is there any other question? Okay, I think we run out of time. So I think this was really an excellent talk. And it's really amazing that you covered all these different aspects that are now relevant, really. So it was a very good overview. And yeah, so I hope things is going well in Canada, and yeah, we keep in touch. And I would like I would like to thank everybody and say goodbye.
Bye.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.